From the California State Senate, this is Senate Spotlight.
Hello there, and welcome to this segment of Senate Spotlight, where we discuss legislative priorities and policy and other related news with members of the California State Senate. From the state capitol here in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green, and proud to have with us for the first time here, actually, State Senator Anthony Portantino from La Cañada Flint Ridge down in Southern California, the 25th Senate District. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Brian, and I have to say it's the great 25th Senate District.
Great 25th Senate
The best
yes.
Senate District in the state of California.
That's good that you feel that way. No,
Absolutely.
I'm glad to hear it. This is, you are also the chair of the Budget Subcommittee on Education, which if we get a little time, we'll talk about education and budget. I was going to call you a freshman senator, but that really is not fair because you are not fresh to any of this legislative process. I know from your years in the Assembly and also as a local elected official. You are an educator. You're the father of 2 daughters. God help you. And I know all those roles have kind of impacted your year and a half already in the Senate. Is that how you see it as well?
Well, you know, actually, it's funny you mentioned my daughters because I tell everybody the lens from which I try to govern is through the lens of a dad.
Right.
You know, I try to see things the way, you know, it would affect my daughters, the way it would affect other people's children, and to affect the future of our state. And so I think it gives me, you know, a well-grounded perspective. You know, certainly my family keeps me humble and keeps me well connected to real life and soccer games and social media issues. My youngest is home with mononucleosis
oh
today.
My gosh,
so,
yes.
you know, so those are the things you gotta, you know, you gotta draw from.
Real life, especially when you have kids, real life intrudes in interesting ways. Well, I was also interested to find out, and maybe others knew, but I hadn't noticed that you also had a career in the film and television industry as a producer and a production designer. And so I have to ask the glib, stupid question about the nexus between the theatrics of the entertainment business and the theatrics and drama here at the Capitol.
James Carville said that politics is the entertainment business for ugly people. So, so I guess I
actually was thinking of that I figured I'd let you say it. So
I fit right in. So
we all do. Yes.
But the worlds are very, very similar. They're high energy worlds.
Right.
You know, the stakes are high. You've got you know, in government, obviously, your deadlines dealing with policy that affects people's lives.
Right.
And with the entertainment industry, you have, you know, deadlines that have multi-million-dollar expenses attached to them trying to make a movie. So they're similar in their energy level, but obviously helping people, you know, get through their life is a lot more important than entertainment.
Well, you mentioned legislating and doing your work here through the lens of a parent, and I realize much of the legislative work going into 2018 that you've had focuses on a lot of touchstone issues affecting us as a state, as a nation, but also as family, as parents. And so we don't have a lot of time, but I want to kind of do a lightning round of some of the bills that you have circulating here circa early 2018. Being a trendsetter on so much of what's public policy right now. For example, let's start with gun safety. Hundreds of people killed in mass shootings that we have seen every year. We're watching our country debate the gun control issues in the aftermath of so many of these shootings. We had one at the YouTube headquarters yesterday as we speak. Right. But let's go back to the one on Valentine's Day, the shooting at the high school in Parkland, Florida, that really bored into our national conscience, really made it distinctive, especially in what a lot of us see sort of a lack of timidity moving forward, like enough is enough, focusing on gun control. And you've actually come forward with legislation in the aftermath of that, right?
I think we have to start with the surviving children of Parkland. You know, Washington isn't leading, those children are leading. You know, if you listen to their statements and the rhetoric, it's direct, it's pointed, it's passionate, and there's no BS in it. It's, you know, we demand that you do something, and we're not going to take, you know, half a loaf. And they are driving the policy, and they're
getting a civics lesson, unfortunately,
well,
in a way that they shouldn't be.
They're not getting a civics. In my mind, they're driving a civics lesson. They are making a point that children should not be going to school with fear, and parents should not be going out and buying backpacks that are bulletproof.
Right.
You know, that's not what this society should be about. I just came back from Korea, and you know, in Korea, the police don't have guns because the people don't have guns. You know, it's a different mindset in other countries about weapons. And here, the children are making the point that they want to be safe, and bad people shouldn't have access to highly mechanized weapons that can have mass shootings. And listening to one of the dads of one of the survivors, he said, we should not as a society get comfortable with watching kids die.
Absolutely.
And so they're driving the debate. So for me, it's just an extension of that movement to say that California, which has been a leader in gun control, needs to do more. And so I do have a bill to raise the purchase age to 21.
That's SB 1100, right?
SB 1100, and I think that's important to do. I mean, both for the public policy perspective, the safety of California, but also to respond to the movement as well.
And this is raising the age, and particularly for long gun purchases.
For long guns, right?
Okay, right.
Absolutely.
And I know that handguns are used in a majority of a lot of the gun deaths, but the long guns are used in a lot of what we see are these mass shootings. Right?
Correct.
And so I know that you aren't a stranger to this gun debate. You had a piece of legislation dealing with open carry.
Absolutely. I banned open carry
too, right?
Yeah, banned open carry again. Common sense. You know, all our gun laws applied to loaded handguns. So if you took the bullets out of the gun, then you could do what you want, and that was just a fine technical term, stupid. So we had to close that loophole.
A lot of the pushback on this issue of age limits is that you're heading down the slippery slope. You limit 18 and 20-year-olds from buying long guns. You're prohibiting them from buying any firearm. You're depriving them of their constitutional rights. You know, they're old enough to go to war. They're old enough to buy a shotgun. So you take that argument in that direction, you're opening up a huge conversation. What do you say to those arguments?
First of all, that's nonsense. Second of all, we recognize that if you're in the military, you're going to have a gun. If you're law enforcement, you're going to have a gun. If you're hunting, you're going to have a gun. What we're talking about is the casual person who shouldn't have a gun, who has no business having a gun, who isn't doing it for one of the legal, normal purposes, and that's what the bill gets at. And so, you know, those arguments are just all red herrings and, frankly, just a lot of nonsense.
Well, I think that this last shooting, the most extraordinary one in Parkland, sort of did raise the level of conversation.
Absolutely.
Even one of our former Supreme Court justices, John Paul Stevens, has come out and saying, why don't we just do away with the Second Amendment? Now, I'm not going to make you sit here and debate the constitutional amendments, but what do you think about that if we're actually having that argument
But I think,
already?
you know what, frankly, I think that is a conversation that needs to be happening. You know, I just go back to what that dad said. We should never as a society get comfortable with watching kids get shot. And whether you're a conservative, whether you're a liberal, whether you're a rural person or whether you're an urban person, whether you live in the Midwest, you know, those are common values, safety of our children. And the Second Amendment was never intended to put children in harm's way. It was intended to have a militia to fight the Tories. And so the times have changed. George Washington is not president, though frankly I wish he were president, but that's a whole nother conversation.
Right, exactly.
But the times and social mores and standards have changed, and to be so intractable that we put children in harm's way is just wrong.
Young people, when they are not tragically, sadly, hunkering down under their desks to avoid a schoolmate with a gun, they're dealing with a lot of stresses. And
Correct.
you know that, you see that as a parent. Suicide, the number 2 leading cause of death among ages
Teens,
15 to
yeah.
24. Yeah. So California Department of Education over the years has finally woke up to, we really need to be doing something at a government level to look at this. You're trying to help with that with a new bill of yours, SB 972, dealing with suicide prevention and involving the schools. Talk about that one.
Well, again, as you may or may not know, my older brother committed suicide about 8 years ago, and so it's an issue that when that tragedy happened, the number of people who called me and talked about a family member of theirs, you know, a brother, a son, a nephew, an aunt, a mom, you know, it's an issue, mental health, that affects every family, and it's one of those taboo subjects that we don't talk about. And, you know, there have been a rash of teenage suicides. And, you know, again, I don't want to pick up the paper and read about anybody's kid who commits suicide. So we have a bill that says when high schools and colleges reprint their student ID, they're going to put the suicide hotline number on those IDs. Now, 99% of the kids won't even know what that number means, but the 1% of the kid that's contemplating taking their own life will have help readily available.
And the schools can make the decision on what number, because there may be a national
Correct.
800 number, but there also may be a local organization that provides some really direct
And the schools can
intervention.
decide where it's going to fit on their ID, whether it's the back, the front. And we reprint student IDs every year, so you know it's a very doable solution that's going to save a life for somebody somewhere, and we should do it.
I didn't know about the tragedy in your family, but it also makes me think too about that males account for nearly 80% of suicides.
Right.
So as somebody whose family has survived this, why do you think that is?
You know, there's just the times, you know, the stresses we put on our kids, the pressures we put on our kids, the lack of personal interaction. You know, so much of life now is texting and social media. And you know, Wendy, when you drive around a neighborhood, do you see kids playing catch in their front yard like you used to? No. You know, everybody's sort of isolated with their headphones on, and so they feel alone. You know, and older people too. It's a more isolated society than when you and I were 8 years old.
Absolutely. Well, from gun safety to suicide prevention to sexual harassment. No, you've got your finger on the pulse of a lot of issues. Yes, it's been a busy year for you. An issue, of course, that's reached an explosive tipping point here in this country and also here within the walls of the state capitol is the sexual harassment issue. The Me Too campaign very much involved. We've heard the stories. We've seen the headlines. Tell us about, you have a piece of legislation, SB 419, that's the Legislative Harassment Retaliation Prevention Act that would give the employees here at the legislature, as well as the lobbyists that work here in the Capitol, some protections and really mirroring rights here at the Capitol with what state and federal law are. Talk about that.
Well, the interesting thing for me is, you know, again, as the father of 2 daughters and as the spouse of a working professional spouse, you know, these are issues. I was raised by my mom. These are issues that, you know, are not topics that we don't talk about in our old household. And back in 2011 and 2012, I actually introduced whistleblower protection in the Capitol at a time when, you know, the Capitol was not ready to embrace having whistleblower protection. So I tried it twice in 2011, 2012, didn't get out of committee. And of course now we have whistleblower protection thanks to Melissa Melendez, who when I termed out 2012, she started introducing the same bill. And so I was a co-author of that legislation, which I was proud to do. Again, before the headlines, it was, you know, it's the right policy to do. But there are some omissions from the original intent, which was to protect legislative staff, and that is everybody else who does business in the Capitol. Whether it's a city council member who comes up to lobby on behalf of their city or a professional lobbyist or other people who do business in the Capitol, they should also be able to do it without fear of sexual harassment. And so that's what this bill does, is try to fill the loopholes from the original legislation, which was important, and I'm very pleased that the governor signed it and happy to be a principal co-author of it. But there's more work to do, and that's what we're trying to do.
Where is the bill right now as we speak?
The bill is out of the Senate, and it's in the Assembly waiting a policy hearing, and I hope it passes.
All right. Well, obviously a new tenor here, everybody taking more seriously these kinds of pieces of legislation. Looking back, you know, we're talking about, boy, just a full plate of a lot of issues that affect California. One could say that one of the blessings on this, when you talk about sort of never more with sexual harassment, with gun violence, it's lit a fire in the populace. There's kind of this renaissance of civic engagement, and I know dysfunction in Washington has a lot to do with that too, but the revulsion and anger from women, the advocacy of young people, it's like critical thinking has arrived at a critical time. We haven't seen this in half a century. What do you think of that?
Well, one thing I've said for 20 years being active in government and politics is the role of the activist is to make us do better. And we're seeing a time where activists are demanding that we do better, whether it's environmental protection, whether it's gun control, whether it's women's rights, whether it's reproductive health care. You know, activists are demanding better from us, and I think it's going to create better policy and you know, drive many of these issues. And it's exciting to be in a position to respond to it.
Another piece of legislation, you became a big fan of sleep-deprived middle school and high school students last year, and again, from the lens of a father, you authored SB 328, which requires the middle and high school students to start their classes no earlier than 8:30. I know you had reams of data from Center for Disease Control, from the Academy of Pediatricians, that the kids do better in class with 8 hours of sleep. Somewhere in there got to be a delay on this process. I know everybody's been waiting to see what happened, and I know a lot of it was local control issues versus state mandate. Where are you with that right now?
Well, there's been some local pushback on it. You know, again, the local control issue, in my opinion, is a red herring on this because it's a public health issue. You know, we don't use lead paint because we know it causes damage. We don't use asbestos because we know it causes cancer. Sleep-depriving teenagers, frankly, is killing them because we know statistically schools that move their time back, suicide goes down. We know car accidents go down, and those are the #1 and #2 killer of teens. So we actually know this is going to save lives. On top of it, We have 30 years of research that show that kids who start school later in high school perform academically better. So we actually have a scientific proven method to improve performance and improve health. And so I have 7 more years to make sure that that becomes California law, and I'm going to make sure that that becomes California law.
Where's the bill right now? What's your next step?
It's got through the Senate and it's over in the Assembly. So Assembly members, I'm coming your way.
I'm noticing a pattern here. What's going on? All right. Well, we'll be interested to follow that because I know you hit headlines last year with that, and it definitely created a lot.
We want to create a safe environment for our kids. That's the goal.
Just a final question before we bail out here, because today, as we speak, is the 50th anniversary of Martin Luther King's assassination. You and I remember it. We were saying before we started rolling that you were in first grade, and so was I, and I remember that as well as the one a few months later with Robert F. Kennedy. Some of the Martin Luther King's family have said over the last couple of days that if he were alive today, he would not be surprised by the lack of the sputtering, if you will, in the progress toward racial equality, toward a sensitivity when we have situations like we've had here in Sacramento with shooting deaths and violence with cops and persons of color. Again, as a dad, as a legislator, as a person from the U.S. here, what's your perspective on that? Obviously, it's a dream deferred so far, right?
Well, you know, I think, first of all, we have to pay our respects to what Martin Luther King did at a time when it was far more difficult to be an activist than it is today. And as I said before, I remember my first grade teacher was an African-American woman, Mrs. Atchison, and I remember like it was yesterday when she came in to talk to us about Martin Luther King's death, and I remember seeing the tears in her eyes and how it deeply affected her. And so that made an effect on me through my whole life as I grew up, seeing firsthand. But today, here we are. We have a president that has made a living, has made a political career out of polarizing America. Putting it as us against them, putting it as just flirting with racism and racial insensitivity and racial divide, and that's not what we want out of our chief executive. I mean, great leaders are healers and unifiers. They're not polarizers. And so I think that's part of what we're seeing today is that people feel it's okay to be polarizing. But I also think there's tremendous progress that has to go. Gun violence against African American youth is not acceptable, but yet here we are in Sacramento dealing with it. And so there's a lot more work to be done. We as leaders have to be forthright and honest about, talking about it. And I think we have to continue to work together to look at training for our police officers. We have to take Martin Luther King's legacy and reboot it in a sense of it's not, even though it's 50 years old, the issues are still the same issues. And that's shame on us for not making more progress.
Well said. Thank you very much for the work that you do and the lens with which you legislate and agitate and advocate. So we appreciate it. There's so many other things we can talk about, things going on in your committee. Let's have you back. So thank you for joining us here for the first time. All right. State Senator Anthony Portantino of La Cañada Flint Ridge from the great 25th Senate District in Southern California. And that is it for this edition of Senate Spotlight. We invite you to join us next time around as we discuss legislative issues and policy with the newsmakers and newsbreakers of the California State Senate. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. Thanks for watching.